It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is a special guest from my online group that I hang out with a fair amount, our Max Tillsley. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Cheers! Great to be here on this bright and sunny. Wait a second, it's sort of midnight over here, but
it's getting sunny here.
Day.
Anyway,
there was a day.
There was a day. It's now past. On either end of the spectrum, because Robert is in Australia and I'm in frozen cold land of the north. So Robert, what are your books about and who are you? Explain to our listeners.
All right, so as you've already given away, I'm from Australia, so it's sort of like the deepest south, right? So you've got a deep south. So I've written a little bit of everything, but I've only published one book so far, The Last Cruise Ship, which is, I call it a space adventure. It could be called a space opera. Amazon loves to call it a middle sci-fi for some reason, but, what do you do? And I'm sort of writing a YA sci-fi and a middle grade urban fantasy. So I'm a little bit of a crazy do-everything person.
Oh yeah, that's a habit close to my heart. But yeah, go on.
I suppose I've been in writing for a couple of years. Before that, I spent about 15 years doing IT. So I love technology, I love science, and then I went into teaching. And I love working with children, but the problem is there's a lot of children in teaching. Who would have thought?
Yeah, shocking.
But yeah, a few sort of life events happened, and I found myself with the chance to write, and I just jumped on top of that kangaroo. I'm trying to translate, taking the bull by the horns thing. Jumped on top of the kangaroo, and off I went and started writing, and here I am today.
All right, just don't put anything in the pouch. The pouch is not for storage of anything but baby kangaroos. Anyway. So you've been a writer for a couple of years. How do you get started as a writer? I mean, you said you got the chance, but what kind of kicked it into high gear for you?
So I was working in the UK. So I spent a couple of years working in the UK, and I was at a point where I was at a bus stop, and I was waiting for a bus to get home. I'd had a long day, and I didn't want to do nothing. And so I sat there and I started thinking, what would some cool powers be for characters? And I just sort of had these ideas floating around in my head. And then about 6 months later, I was in Paris, as you do, at a cafe because my wife and child were off in Euro Disney, and I'd already done that. And I've got to say, once was enough. But there I was. So, cafe, Paris. And I thought, I'll write a story. And, of course, for most people, that would be some heart-wrenching tale or some deep emotional journey. For me, I started writing an outline for a zombie story, and as you do. So I had that, and I started writing, and I was teaching at the same time, and it was a little bit much. So I hit the point where I had to pause. And then, long story, I found myself back in Australia, and I got diagnosed with cancer. You go, oh, yay, cancer. No. So I got diagnosed with cancer, and after the treatment, it was, I needed a bit of time to recover, and I had done this writing thing, and I quite enjoyed it. And my absolutely amazing wife said, well, why don't you finish it? And so I took that time, and I finished it. And that was my first novel. So not my first published novel. And I think, I don't know if you're of that sort, but many of us writers find our first novel is a learning process and not necessarily ready for public consumption.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That was definitely me for the first 3 novels, actually.
So yeah, so that's how I got started, and it's all just sort of gone on from there as ideas have cascaded, and it's just trying to write, trying to get those books out, and balancing life at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's kind of an interesting story. I didn't know about the cancer thing. That's but good on you for making the most of it, I guess.
Or it's that sort of. Often you'll hear these stories, these life-changing moments, and you're like, oh, wow, I feel so inspired. Honestly, it wasn't like that. It was like, and then, okay, this is great. Australia getting wonderful medical treatment, all that sort of thing. And look, obviously things weren't necessarily comfortable, but it was amazingly low fuss, if I can put it that way. It might sound sort of weird, but it was sort of low fuss. And so sort of coming out of that situation, it wasn't like I went through this rebirth, but it did. I just had this opportunity, and you hit a point where you just got to take the opportunity. So yeah, for me, that's what that moment was. It was an opportunity.
Nice. And in that context, it's definitely a good opportunity. I mean, good, and but it is kind of like, life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. I mean, I make lemonade anyway, but there you go.
When life gives me lemons, I put it into a Corona and drink it.
Oh, well, there you go. That's the alternative. However, as far as and actually though, speaking of the writing process more, you definitely write across genres. That's for sure. Would you say you blend genres as well?
That's absolutely. Some of it's sort of a little more visible with some things that I haven't released yet. But the first one that I wrote that hasn't been released, I'll say the title. I called it Blood Red. And so it was for a zombie apocalypse novel, but I wanted to bring in characters with superpowers, but not in your sort of your Marvel or DC styles, sort of, and I mean this. I don't mean this in a nasty way, but they're not so spandex and all that sort of thing. But people with abilities, and so, and I loved that aspect of exploring, mixing those things together. And that's, part of the reason why I'm writing a middle grade fantasy at the moment is because sometimes when you take a concept and you mix it with something else, then you get a chance to show it to a new audience. And I'm writing this middle grade fantasy partly for my child, because a lot of urban fantasy, we've had like the marvelous stuff that Harry Potter is as well, but we've not had, I think, work that's suitable for kids that age. That's a little bit grittier. And that's, I've loved sort of playing with aspects of, there's magic. I've thrown a little bit of sort of spy elements to it, and ghosts and that sort of thing, and just being able to sort of blend that in and then showing it to an audience so that they can share aspects of what you've grown up loving yourself.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I really like genre blending myself, but I find it difficult to actually get those books to the right people, because I think generally one genre is bigger than the others and so you kind of target one genre when you actually publish.
You're absolutely spot on. There's a fancy work that I'm, as you're probably well aware, if your audience isn't, but I'm about 130,000 words into a fantasy novel, which is, even for fantasy, is getting on the long side. It's not as long as some of those truly epic ones, but it's getting there, and that's a mix of genre. And I know that even just thinking about how on earth I would do the cover to show what it is to an audience would be incredibly hard. And one of the big things about being a writer is working out not just the great story, but how you can explain that story in blurb and in cover so that people aren't frightened about the aspects that they're not familiar with. If they're into fantasy and there's some technology, how would you show that bit of technology and just give them the hint that it's there so they're ready for it, so that perhaps they're intrigued, but they're not put off by it? Because sometimes we go, yeah, I've seen something with a bit of that and a bit of this, and I don't like it. Or I like my fantasy to be fantasy. I like my my romance to be this nice, clean thing here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like these different things mixed together. So yeah, it's challenging.
Yeah, I definitely. There's this one book that I haven't published. I mean, I made 60,000 words into it and didn't finish it, which is it's a huge amount investment of time, at least for back then when I was writing it. And that book, I was so uncomfortable with mostly how I was characterizing the protagonist that I was like, I don't know if this is a good idea, and so I took a break from it for 5 years. And but that book was also a kind of, I think you'd be falling to steampunk now, but it was very weird fantasy because it took place in this world where, okay, there's all this advanced technology, but it's all created from a factory that was built by the gods or something at some point. And you just order anything you want as a human, and the god's spirit makes the factory produce it for you as long as you provide the materials. So all you have to do is gather the materials and boom, you get to build a car or a gun or whatever.
And I love that as a concept, because one of the things which I found interesting, sort of when you look at things like the Star Trek world and you compare it to some of the other sort of science fiction sort of elements, when you have, and it doesn't matter whether it's a godlike being or whether it's a piece of technology, but when you remove a limiting factor, that completely changes the underlying social structure. Because, we live in a resource scarce world.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of the way we interact with each other, our politics, our sociology, all sort of comes around. How do we deal with the factor of, if I have this, then that necessarily means that someone else doesn't? So, yeah, I know it's a fascinating concept, but you're right in that sometimes it's us, and that sometimes we've got the idea, but we haven't quite found the way to express it well, or perhaps we're being a bit harsh on ourselves, and we've actually got a really good story there, but we don't have faith in it yet. So we might have written it or written most of it, but until we found that bit where we're going, yes, I know that this is the story, I think we can get a little bit put off. We can hit a point and go, oh, I don't know if I want to invest any more in it.
Yeah, that book. I was definitely exploration writing, and it was discovery writing, every bit of it, basically, except for the fact that it was all based off of my second novel. That's the funny thing. It was a reskin of my second novel originally.
Yeah,
and then I added so many weird elements that it became its own thing completely. Yeah.
I was going to say, that idea of taking something you worked with before and changing it up and replaying it, that definitely is something where a lot of writers have done that, because they're exploring the idea, they're teasing out new issues, they're trying to perhaps they want to correct something that they thought they didn't get right, but what they're actually doing is just finding a new story within that existing story. I'm sure everyone's sort of familiar with people who say there's only X many stories in the world, whether it's 2, 3, 5, 10, 13 or whatever, but you can always take these basic building blocks and you can just shift it, and sometimes it's superficial, sometimes it's deeper, but going through and doing that, I think it's really important. You don't see an expert furniture a cabinet maker. They're not going to go, well, made a 4-door cabinet, I'm done, never going to make another one. They're always going to work and tweak and that, and that's what we do with our craft too.
No, it makes so much sense, and you really did articulate well. I think the part about just you have the raw materials. Actually a lot like my factory story. You have the raw materials, but you also have some elements that are partially built. You can improvise. It's a kit bash kind of thing, to people who like I build models on this. That's something I've been doing forever, even longer than I've been writing. And when you build one of these war game models, there's so many parts, and you can just I'll just switch this out from this other kit, and boom, now you have a completely different model that you couldn't have made with just one kit. And it can work the same way with a story.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, she's talking about making things. So one of the things I do in my spare time, very, very slowly and very, very badly, is to work on armor, some medieval armor. So I make mail or chain mail. And So it's an interesting sort of material working with metal that you can undo. You can sort of infinitely refine and change the form of it, but you still got those same basic underlying elements. You still got those links that you're working with. It's all a matter of how much you're willing to explore and, quite frankly, how much patience you have in the end.
Oh yeah, no, that's a good example as well, especially because any of those individual pieces it really is usable for anything almost. In the case of chainmail, right? Like you get these tiny little links, and they're more or less interchangeable with each other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the interesting thing about a story, to get back to that a little bit, is that in a story that it's true of most of the parts. They actually are interchangeable with each other. Like most of the characters, you could switch out for another character. You could, but the interesting thing is that they will appear very different to the reader. So the salient details are different.
Absolutely, in the same way that when you look at someone's life, the little variations actually sort of build up to those big changes. I mean, that's one of the sort of things I've been doing with my writing of late. When I first started, I wrote an outline from the start all the way through to the end, and then I sort of edited the outline and then sort of went on to story writing. And then I started looking at story structure on later novels, and I was spreadsheeting. So you can imagine all these elements of story that we're talking about, these character details and events and things. I actually spreadsheeted and I could move them around. And then for the novel that I just finished, I sort of took that in a even more sort of exploratory way, in that as I came up with these ideas, I just wrote them on tiny little slivers of card, and then I gave myself the freedom to explore by just shifting on the table those little pieces of card around into different orders and going, well, these ideas here, which would shift the novel one way, I'm going to pull those ones aside and I'm going to try this, this order of events here. And I could have just as easily put other ones in. I could probably go and collect all of those and throw them up in the air, put them back down on the table, and put an entirely new story using exactly those same elements, but just in different order.
Yeah, you're talking about the scenes, right? The kind of elements of.
Even I would go down to that term that they tend to use in movies, in script writing, the beats. The sort of that smaller. And I'm probably not using it right because I'm not a script writer, but those smaller individual elements. So often within a chapter, and this was for middle grade, so the chapters are only 1,000 words long, but I might have 5 or 6 elements, sometimes up to 10, that would make up those 1 or 2 scenes within that chapter.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. I don't generally work on that level when I outline, but I also don't outline much. So there you go. Yeah, I mean, when I do a scene, like it's usually a single sentence description of a chapter or a scene, and so maybe there's 3 sentences. If my chapter has 2 scenes in it, it'll be 1 sentence per scene, 1 sentence for the whole chapter.
See, I could view myself perhaps as a recovering outliner. When I started writing, the outlines were really powerful for me because they allowed me to have some faith in what I was doing. But as I started to get more confident with what I was doing, I found that the outlining structure would tend to have enough issues that I would discover as I went through that it became hard work managing them. And it's one of those things, I had some trouble working with sequels, and I'm pretty sure a lot of that came from having sort of tied myself down so much with the outline that the story didn't have freedom to breathe. And I don't begrudge the time that I spent on that, but I'm sort of now that little bit of freedom sort of for me is proving to be, a really wonderful experience.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I've done almost every form of outlining or technique before I hit on the idea that basically at this point I've done everything at least once on at least one book, right? I've written, 15, 20 books at this point. Mm-hmm. So I've used almost every technique in some way. And I have a good idea also of story structure. I mean, I've published, actually 15 books. I must have written more like 30 at this point. But not all of them are super long. But the thing is, once you know the structure, once you know have all that down and kind of in your head, then the outlining becomes less useful, or less necessary at any rate. It gets to be useful for other things.
I find it interesting because I've listened to an awful lot of writing podcasts. I think the writing community is one of the best communities in the world just because of that sharing. And I love there's two writers that I love who are diametrically opposed. You've got K.M. Weiland, and she writes things like Portal Fantasy, and she is really fascinated about structure and has some very strong ideas around ideal points for events and things like that for her work. And then on the other side, you got good old J. Daniel Sawyer, who is, I think, emotionally sort of scarred when you mention the concept of an outline, because I won't speak for him, but I think sort of that freedom to write the story is very important from his point of view. And sort of I had these two different ideas I was hearing so much about. Start off with one, I'm finding another works, but I mean, it's one of those weird sort of things where you can take whatever process works for you, but I don't think you can necessarily assume that whatever process you use now will be with you, next year or 10 years time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Speaking as somebody who's tried a whole ton of different processes, that's definitely true. I mean, like for a while there would be like every book, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to do it this way. And every book will be different. Like the first book I published, which is now currently unpublished, it'll come back eventually under a new name and a new form. Basically, everything will be different about it, but it'll be back. But that book, it's new identity. It's going to get into the witness protection program because that original book was very difficult to read. That was the main reason it got unpublished rather than just rebranded. But
yes.
The thing about that book was I tried to write it to a formula that I read about in this book called, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before for people who've listened to other episodes. There was this book where there's a book of interviews with Michael Moorcock, the famous fantasy author, and how he would write a book in 4 days. He explains in the first interview in this book. It's called the book's called "Death Is No Obstacle." Anyway, it's a book of interviews with him between these two writers. And the thing is that in that first, he says, I write the book in 4 days, but he also took a really dim view of writing fantasy specifically. And this is how he'd write his fantasy novels. And he was more of a literary minded guy, and he hated fantasy in a lot of ways. That's what I can kind of say. Not hated, but he saw it as just a means to make money. And I thought it was interesting. And so in hindsight, for somebody who loves fantasy, it wasn't the right method, because this is just how you write a book that you don't want to write. Like if I was ever going to ghostwrite again, that's probably what I'd do. But as for books I love that I really want to see on the page, I like for the sequel that I didn't use the same formula. I wrote a 60,000 word book in like 2 months using the formula, and it said 4 days, but whatever, I'm slow. So it took 2 months, and this 60,000 word book was not that great because I rushed through certain elements that needed to be explained. But I followed this formula so closely, despite the fact that my world is much weirder, honestly, than Moorcock's would have been in the same context. It's that kind of thing. And my adventure was much stranger. So there should have been more groundwork laid, and that's basically why I took the book down, because I need to lay that groundwork.
I find that fascinating, actually, because that's sort of, it reminds me, I think some of my early writing really came from the factor of having to do so many university essays, and so I developed a sort of very structured way of dot pointing, or sort of almost like section headings that I would then fill out to become my essay, so I could get it done, at 3 a.m. on the day that it's due. Mm-hmm. And now I'm thinking, I wonder if that was really sort of what flavored my writing sort of preferences to begin with, because having that structure really was that sort of that same style, that anchoring, that nuts and bolts way of knowing you can get something done. But as you say, sort of, while for some people that's brilliant, but for other people, it creates these points where you're sort of enslaved to the structure, rather than the structure being a scaffolding from where you build.
Yes. I also think not to soapbox too long here, but I think one of the other key things about the Moorcock's method of writing 4 books, and I've had writers on here come. My friend Marissa Lingen was on here one time on this podcast, and she mentioned something about his potential use of stimulants and stuff to actually get the job done in 4 days. But I mean, hey, who doesn't use stimulants now? I'm whatever. Coffee's a powerful drug. But the thing is, I actually don't think his word counts are that crazy. 15,000 words a day is a lot, but if you're a professional full-time writer, I could do that. I could technically do it physically.
Yeah. I think my top was 5,000. I don't think I hit 6,000. I think 15,000, and my wrist would probably fall off. But
fair enough, and it's different for everybody. Word count's not the most important thing, that's for sure. Anyway, so I think I went off on a tangent there, but I do like that book still. I think it was an interesting read. It's just not necessarily writing advice that in a way that's going to make sense. It's kind of like Ernest Hemingway's writing advice, to be honest, where half of it wasn't really applicable to normal people, or it was an outright lie in the case of Hemingway.
I think you just have to soak up all of this different information and then play, experiment, work out what's right for you. One of the things that I found so useful, I think it was Dan Wells' 7-point story structure, which is what is it? Hook, inciting incident. I think it calls it plot point 1. You have a pinch point where things go bad. You have the midpoint where your mentor comes along. Then everything gets really bad in your pinch point 2, and then you have the that reveal of information you need before climax and victory, and all that sort of thing. And while that is a very structured approach to it, for me, when I wrote the last cruise ship, I spreadsheeted, but I actually overlaid that 7-point structure on a bunch of different characters and different plot elements, and then spread them through to create a more complex story. Working so that there were these constant points of what's going to happen next and pressure here while this thing might not be such a big deal, and it was really useful to do that. But now I hope that a lot of that's more inbuilt in my head, so I can sort of do that naturally, and I can do a little bit more of Jim Butcher's approach of okay, let's start off with an event. How can I make that event worse for the main character? Ooh, how can I tease the main character by making them think things are going where they want, and then make it worse for them, and then worse. Oh, and you know what? I think I can make it worse.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I and also the 7-point structure. There's a good video about it on where he takes apart the Matrix, and he does that with multiple 7-point systems. Dan Wells on YouTube, I believe. And so he uses it's 2 7, but he uses like 5 or 6 7-point structures in the course of this video.
Oh, fascinating!
Yeah, so he does basically what you were doing. Yeah, the 7 points. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, sorry. This is the delay between Australia and the US. We must be worlds away. But I've seen the videos. If people want to check it out, he has some really good videos sort of just explaining the method in general. I'm going to have to go back and see this Matrix thing. So please continue. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, so the 7-point system he uses there is like 7 points per plot. So there's way more than 7 points in a given story, much like you were describing with your book. And you kind of came to that on your own, but that's effectively what he said, what he would do with a novel as well.
Obviously, that's just because I'm brilliant, but
Dan Wells is pretty smart too. I mean, he's pretty good.
No, he's very good. Yes.
And then that kind of segues a little bit. I mean, I haven't been reading Wells lately, but I really did enjoy his book. I'm Not a Serial Killer. The first 3 books of that series I read, I really love those. And so what have you been reading lately, Robert?
All right. So it's funny because what I did, I spent a little bit of time earlier today just having a look back and thinking, what have I been going through lately, and sort of what books were sort of important to me and that sort of thing. And the first thing I'd say is I've actually been, and I say reading, but I've been listening because this is one on Audible. And I've listened to this series before, but I've just had to come back and reread it. And this is Dennis E. Taylor's We Are Legion, We Are Bob. I don't know if you've read or listened to it, but
I have listened to it.
Narrated by Ray Porter, who is fantastic. If I could get him to narrate The Last Cruise Ship, I would be in author heaven. I love this. The story, to me, does an amazing job of, in many ways, sort of throwing away a lot of what we just talked about with structure. It is such a smooth, continuous read. It is. It's easy flowing. I love the concept of being revived as an AI and where that leads with his mission. I won't spoil it in case anyone hasn't read it, but just that just his character dealing with it, but dealing with it not in the angst-riddled way that, often if it's going to be a sci-fi movie, it's going to be an art house, angst-ridden sort of thing. But this he makes it fun. He makes it sort of poignant at times as well. But it's a great adventure, and I absolutely love it. And so I'm listening to that one at the moment as well.
I've listened to that one twice. I listened to, and it's a really good story. I've only listened to the first one all the way through. I have the other two that I've listened to the second one partially at this point. Yeah. But it's funny how I mean, at least with me, when I go back over the first book in a series that I really like, and then it's like, without having read I've done this before, but I did this with the Chronicles of Amber as well, the Nine Princes in Amber book, where it's like I just have the audiobook for the first book, so I guess I'll listen to that again.
So it's funny that you say that. So I'm holding in front of me Roger Zelazny's The Great Book of Amber, which is the entire 10-book, which is really sort of 2 5-book sort of series together, which I have read as individual books probably twice, and then this sort of collection about 5 times as well. It's fascinating. Actually, I'm probably going off in crazy tangents here, but as a writer, it was fascinating going through and rereading them the last time, because I noticed when you take a small book and read small book after small book in the same series, you start to notice certain attributes in the writing style. And I cannot tell you how much this book affected my imagination as a child, but it was fascinating when he gets to the sword fights. They're actually quite repetitive.
Yes.
And they're a little bit unimpressive. Now, that said, this is decades and decades later, so I don't mean to impugn his talent, because he was a fantastic writer. But it was certainly, when you put your writing mind on and you go back and reread some of the things you love, sometimes you spot things that you never noticed that were great. And other times you're going, ooh, I need to keep that in mind when I do my action scenes. What if I'm being repetitive? Ooh, I hope my editor notices.
Though on a certain level, you can get an effect with repetition that can work. But I would argue that Zelazny, I mean, at least the ones I've read, I have not read the entire book of Amber, but the fight scenes I've read from Zelazny aren't always that repetitive. And the sword fights in particular, though, they get kind of, but they do get a little repetitive in that series. But one of the things I thought was that he does really well as regards action is the bigger battle scenes. I really like how those are handled.
Absolutely.
Where there's an army clashing.
That scene when I can't remember the main character's name now. Corwin, is it?
Yeah, Corwin.
He's leading an army up the stairs to the Castle of Amber, and millions upon millions have essentially died to reach this point. And it's just such powerful writing, and yes, the scale is there, and it's massive, and yet it's also very personal. I mean, utterly amazing.
Yes, indeed. And I gotta say, I just gotta stand for that part, because that's, I mean, as much as there's some of the personal combat is not perfect in that series as far as it's handled in some ways. but the battle scenes are fantastic. And
Yeah.
And sometimes there was this one particular one in Guns of Avalon, which is the second book, and this is about as far as I've gotten into the series because I'm just a terrible reader, and I only started reading it a few years ago.
Yeah.
But in Guns of Avalon, where he's leading an army in basically a Camelot kind of setting, and he gets in and he's fighting. They're fighting these like beast men, these army of part animal creatures, and after they get, but this one chapter where he follows like this entire it takes like 2 pages to do the whole battle. And then he gets into the room with this evil creature that's kind of commanding the enemy army, and eventually, it goes down, whittling down from a sword fight to them just choking each other until one of them goes down. It's kind of insane how cool that structure is, where it's like we start with the biggest thing part of the story, the biggest element of people, and we get down to the most basic, simple, like one-on-one, not even using weapons kind of fight, and it's kind of fantastic.
You know what? And I think that's brilliant. And I think you're right. It shows again and again in his work, and he does it well, and he does it uniquely each time at that. And that actually reminds me a lot when we look at things like, Star Trek and even Star Wars and a lot of other sci-fi, especially when you have these big ships and things like that. Often at the end, we want these big battles, but we still ultimately we want it to be personal too. And that sort of so often, if you can do that well, that it does bring it down to that raw struggle that I think sort of really goes to the heart. For most of us, it really affects us because we can imagine that as much as we love the grandeur and the scale, that intimacy of that life or death moment is really powerful.
No, absolutely. And we are running really low on time, but so I'll just briefly say I actually started reading the novel Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, the first James Bond novel. I started reading that recently, and I'm also a few hundred pages into The Warded Man by Peter V. Brett. Those are both really good books for totally different reasons. But since we're low on time, I don't think we have to go into that.
I was going to say I was going to talk about Numbercast, but if I say his name, I'm going to utterly mangle it. You say it for me.
Yadanja Wijaratne?
Yes, thank you. Wadanya. All right, I'm not going to kill his name. But he's written a fascinating book that I'm partway through it, and having sort of spent 15 years working in IT, I love the way that he manages to create the different atmosphere of the corporate culture in there as well. So that one I'm loving. And there's a whole bunch of other books that I'm partway through, but I get that, if I kept on going, we're going to be your nighttime and my daytime before we finish.
Absolutely. He's been a guest on this show before as well, and he's great. So the other thing I noticed that I really like his story Omega Point. It's the only thing I've actually completed of reading of his, but because it's only 45 pages long or whatever, but it's a great story. And it's about, but I was interested because I want to ask you a question about Numbercast, but just as background, this is a story about basically this God character in the history of an entire universe fit into 25, 35 pages, plus a bunch of appendices about the Teilhard hypothesis. So it's really interesting because his scale is like he handles the hard science fiction and the scale stuff really well. Like the setting material is amazing. And I'm always, in this book and in a short story, it's not really worth telling. Or it's hard to tell how characterization works because it's very different than in a novel. But I'm curious as to how his point of views are handled and stuff, and how he gets personal in these books. Because I just am because I just don't hear him talk about it a lot.
Yeah, okay, that's sort of interesting. What I sort of found, as again, I'm sort of only about halfway through, so I can't say sort of too much either way. But I sort of found that his style is it's really nice and casual. It sort of gives you that feeling of being there. I don't think he's at all afraid to show people for who they are as well. And his main character in this novel, I wouldn't say is particularly shining knight. Definitely not. There's a character who's coming along and he's getting the rewards of what he's involved in, but they're all sort of shown as very believable, but flawed individuals, and I think because he's so comfortable doing that, he doesn't waste a huge amount of time sort of sort of belaboring the point. So the story sort of flows along as we see that, but you pick it up, you sort of absorb it as you go, rather than having a 5-page info dump.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, I haven't just only read one of his more unconventional works. That's basically why I was curious, because that one. I mean, and in that one, I remember the character, but the character was such a weird being, right? Like he's not human, so it's kind of, and not even an alien. He's like this weird like entity from beyond space and time in some sense.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, because as an author, he's got so many sort of different skill sets from his background with data and other sorts of things, and his experience growing up sort of in an area that's not generic Western sort of set. I think he's much closer to some challenges that sort of you and I might sort of read about, but day to day we don't experience. And I just think he does a great job of sort of therefore going, what, I'm going to get in there and share my ideas, write my stories, explore my things, and I'm not going to be afraid to do what I want to do. And I think that shows in his writing.
Yeah, it's great. And yeah, so Number Cast by Yudhinjaya Wijeratne. I'm not the best with the name either, but I'll try. And of course all those other books we mentioned. So Robert, where can people find your work? Because we barely talked about it, but it's probably just
me.
Yeah, exactly.
So the last cruise ship is up on Amazon. The author name there is Max Tillsley. Finally, a middle name that I could use. It is actually Max. There you go. And shortly, I do have coming up. So there'll be, I should say, Amazon and iBooks, and you can get them through your online readers and all your sort of ebooks and that sort of stuff, and also print copies. But I do have upcoming Rebirth, which is a sort of young adult science fiction. It's set in Australia, but I think it's utterly approachable to any reader from no matter where they are. And I love that, because in that book I sort of explore some of the ideas of family, and there's such a rich history of people getting replaced by something different, something other in our culture. And so I explore that, and I love doing that. And so that'll be out hopefully in the next 2 months. And the same, I have My Dad the Assassin, which will be out in the next couple of months as well. And so this one I was talking about has ghosts, and it's sort of got these 3 girls. They're 12 years old, and one of them, the father, goes missing, and then all these little things start to turn up, and starts to go, well, who is my father? And sort of ultimately decides that her father must have been, or is, because we don't know what's happened to him, an assassin. And it sort of goes off a bit crazy into sort of ghosts and magic from there. So that'll be coming out soon as well.
Well, excellent. Thanks for being on the show. And
thank you for having me. Been brilliant, and I'm sure we will catch up at some time in the future.
Yeah, soon. And as for this podcast, you can find us and this and more of these episodes at mentalcellarpublications.com, hosted by Libsyn, so you can find us there as well. And my latest novel, Ice War, is now out on Amazon as of this recording and as of this release. So that's the 3rd book of my Pillar Universe series. It's the completion of the 1st arc. And so go check that out, or check out the early books if you haven't read them yet.
That's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to getting the first one and checking them out, because you've described such an amazing world. Oh, I should add, I do actually have a website, www.blackskybooks.com, where I've got some sample chapters and some audio actually of the YA sci-fi Rebirth is up there as well, if you wish to horrify yourself with my voice. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into your Pillar universe. So I shouldn't destroy your end by that, but it's exciting.
Oh, well, thank you. And Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.